Hello and welcome. Tonight, we're embarking on perhaps the most profound journey the human mind can take, a gentle exploration into one of existence's deepest mysteries, the question that has haunted and comforted humanity since the very dawn of consciousness itself. Is there life after death? What happens when our hearts beat their final rhythm, when our lungs draw their last breath, when the light behind our eyes begins to fade? This isn't just an academic question or a philosophical curiosity. It's deeply, intimately personal. Every single one of us will one day face this threshold. Every person we've ever loved, every stranger we've passed on the street, every human being who has ever lived, has either crossed through this mysterious doorway or will someday stand before it. And yet, despite its absolute universality, death remains shrouded in shadow, wrapped in questions we can barely articulate, let alone answer. But here's what makes our exploration tonight different, what makes it both fascinating and perhaps even comforting. We're not approaching this question through theology or pure speculation. Instead, we'll walk through the latest scientific research, examine real documented cases, and explore what happens in the final moments and hours of life. Accounts from people who have come back, studies from respected medical institutions, and phenomena that challenge everything we thought we knew about consciousness, the brain, and the nature of existence itself. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind relax. We're going to take our time with this, moving slowly and thoughtfully through the evidence, the stories, and the mysteries that science is only beginning to unravel. By the end of our time together tonight, you may not have all the answers, no one does, but you'll have something perhaps more valuable, a deeper understanding of what we do know, what we're discovering, and why the question itself might be more complex and more beautiful than we ever imagined. Let's begin where all great inquiries begin, at the very roots of human consciousness, in those earliest moments when our ancestors first became aware of their own mortality. Imagine, if you will, standing on an ancient plain tens of thousands of years ago. The sun is setting in brilliant oranges and reds, and around a fire, a small group of humans huddles together. They've just buried one of their own. They placed flowers on the grave, arranged the body with care, and included tools and ornaments for the journey ahead. Because even then, even at the very dawn of human awareness, we couldn't accept that death was simply an ending. Archaeological evidence tells us that Neanderthals buried their dead with intention and ceremony more than 60,000 years ago. They placed red ochre on the bodies, positioned them carefully, and included objects that suggested they believed in something beyond the physical form. This wasn't just disposal of a corpse. This was recognition that the person who had lived in that body might continue in some form, It was humanity's first fumbling attempt to answer the question that would echo through every civilization that followed. What happens next? Think about what this means. Before we built cities, before we invented writing, before we understood the stars or the seasons or how to plant crops, we were already grappling with death and what might lie beyond it. This question isn't some recent philosophical development or religious innovation. It's woven into the very fabric of human consciousness, as fundamental to who we are as language or tool use, or the ability to imagine futures that don't yet exist. As civilizations rose and fell, each culture developed its own answer to this eternal question, and the variety is stunning. The ancient Egyptians believed in such a detailed and complex afterlife that they spent tremendous resources preparing for it. They mummified bodies with painstaking precision, believing the physical form would be needed again. They filled tombs with food, clothing, furniture, even board games, everything a person might need in the next world. The walls of these tombs were covered with detailed instructions, maps of the afterlife, spells, and incantations to help the deceased navigate the challenges they would face. This wasn't superstition or primitive thinking. These were sophisticated people with advanced mathematics, engineering, and astronomy, and they believed with absolute conviction that death was just a transition. Travel east to ancient India, and you find a completely different understanding. The concept of reincarnation and karma suggested that death wasn't a journey to another place, but rather a return, a soul cycling through multiple lives, learning and evolving, working toward eventual liberation from the cycle itself. Death wasn't an ending, or even a single transition, but one turn of an eternal wheel. Your actions in this life would determine your circumstances in the next, creating a moral framework where death was simultaneously an ending and a beginning, where the self persisted but the form constantly changed. The ancient Greeks offered yet another perspective. Their underworld wasn't quite heaven or hell, but a shadowy realm where all souls went, regardless of how they'd lived. Only the truly exceptional, the greatest heroes or the most terrible villains, faced special fate. For most, death meant becoming a shade, a dim echo of your former self, conscious but diminished, aware but unable to truly engage with life. It was an existence defined more by absence than presence, suggesting that while something continued after death, it wasn't necessarily something we should desire. Move forward to the Norse traditions, and death becomes almost celebratory for those who died well. Warriors slain in battle would feast eternally in Valhalla, drinking and fighting, and celebrating until the final battle at the end of time. Death wasn't something to fear if you died with honor. It was a promotion, an elevation to something grand. Even those who died of old age or illness weren't simply gone. They went to hell, which despite its name wasn't a place of punishment but simply a different afterlife. Quieter perhaps, but still a continuation. And we can't ignore the Tibetan traditions, which developed perhaps the most detailed maps of the afterlife ever conceived. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes an elaborate journey through different bardos or intermediate states between death and rebirth, each presenting different visions, challenges, and opportunities for liberation. Death wasn't instant but a process that could take 49 days, during which consciousness moved through different realms and states. These weren't vague spiritual concepts but precise descriptions, complete with timelines and instructions for the dying person and those around. What's striking about all these different cultural responses is not their variety but their universality. Every single human culture we've ever studied has developed beliefs about what happens after death. Every single one has concluded that death isn't simply cessation, that something, whether we call it a soul, spirit, consciousness, or life force, continues in some form. The details differ wildly, but the core intuition remains the same. We are more than our physical bodies, and death is a transformation rather than annihilation. Why? Why has every human society, separated by vast distances and developing independently, reached this same basic conclusion? Skeptics might argue it's wish fulfillment, a psychological defense mechanism against the terror of non-existence, and that's certainly part of it. The human mind recoils from the concept of its own permanent extinction, but is that the whole story? Or is there something deeper? Some intuition or understanding, or perhaps even direct experience that has guided humanity toward this belief? Consider the sheer consistency of certain elements across these vastly different traditions. The idea of a journey or transition appears in almost every culture's death beliefs. The notion that how you live affects what happens after death is nearly universal. The concept of multiple realms or states of existence appears again and These similarities emerge independently, separated by oceans and millennia, suggesting they might reflect something more than cultural imagination. Even more intriguing are the personal experiences that have shaped these beliefs throughout history. Near-death experiences aren't modern phenomena. Ancient texts are filled with accounts of people who came close to death and reported remarkably similar experiences to what we hear today. Plato wrote about a soldier who died in battle and returned with accounts of the afterlife. Medieval texts are filled with visions of heaven and hell experienced by people who were gravely ill or injured. Indigenous cultures around the world have traditions of shamanic journeys to the realm of the dead and back. These weren't random hallucinations. They showed patterns, consistencies, and elements that appeared across cultures without any possibility of cross-contamination. People who knew nothing of each other's beliefs would report similar experiences, moving through darkness toward light, encountering deceased loved ones, feeling a profound sense of peace, undergoing a life review where their actions and their impacts were revealed with stunning clarity. But here's where we stand today. In the early 21st century, we've sent probes to the edge of our solar system and mapped the human genome. We've split the atom and decoded the structure of DNA. We've built machines that can think and tools that can see across billions of light years. And yet the question of what happens after death remains as mysterious as it was to our ancestors sitting around that fire 60,000 years ago. Maybe even more mysterious, because now we know so much about how the brain works, how consciousness emerges from neural activity, how every thought and feeling correlates with specific patterns of electrical and chemical activity in the organ inside our skulls. If consciousness is just the product of brain activity, then it should stop when the brain stops, right? Death should be simple. The machine breaks down, the program stops running, the lights go out, and yet something doesn't quite add up. Because in the past few decades, as our technology has improved and our ability to study the dying process has become more sophisticated, we've started to encounter phenomena that don't fit neatly into that materialist framework. We've documented cases that challenge our assumptions, experiences that seem to suggest consciousness might be more than just brain activity, and mysteries that science is only beginning to seriously investigate. This is where we are now, standing at a fascinating crossroads between ancient wisdom and modern science, between the timeless human intuition that death is not the end, and the growing body of empirical evidence that seems to support that intuition in unexpected ways. We have tools now that our ancestors couldn't have imagined: brain scanners, careful documentation, controlled studies, verification methods, and we're using them to examine the very experiences that have shaped human belief since the beginning. What we're discovering is neither simple affirmation of religious belief, nor straightforward materialist explanation. It's something more complex, more nuanced, and in many ways more fascinating than either extreme. It's a picture that's slowly coming into focus, piece by piece, study by study, revealing that the question of life after death might not be quite what we thought it was. Because before we can ask whether consciousness survives death, we need to understand what consciousness actually is, where it comes from, and how it relates to the physical brain. And that, as it turns out, is one of the deepest mysteries in all of science. So with that foundation laid, with an understanding of how deeply this question runs through human history, and how universal the intuition of survival has been, let's turn to the modern evidence. Let's look at what happens to people when they come as close to death as it's possible to come and still return. Let's examine the cases that are hardest to explain away, the research that's most carefully conducted, and the implications that are most profound. Let's explore what science is revealing about those final moments, those threshold experiences,
and what they might tell us about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of its survival beyond the death of the body.
Picture this moment. Your heart has stopped beating. Blood is no longer flowing to your brain. According to every medical textbook, you should be unconscious within seconds, unaware of anything happening around you. Your brain, starved of oxygen, should be shutting down, with organized thought becoming impossible. You're clinically dead, and yet, if you're among a significant percentage of people who survive such an experience, you might find yourself more conscious than you've ever been in your life, more aware, more alert, thinking with stunning clarity. You might find yourself floating above your own body, watching doctors frantically trying to restart your heart. You might hear every word they're saying, note every detail of the scene, and observe things happening in other rooms that you couldn't possibly see. Then you might find yourself moving through darkness toward a light of indescribable brilliance, meeting deceased relatives who tell you it's not your time yet, experiencing a life review where every action you've ever taken is revealed in its full emotional impact, and feeling a love and peace so profound that returning to your body feels like a cruel punishment. This is the near-death experience, and it's far more common and far more studied than most people realize. These aren't just random hallucinations or the confused dreams of an oxygen-starved brain. They follow patterns, show consistencies across cultures, and include elements that are extremely difficult to explain through conventional neuroscience. And most importantly, they're being studied with increasing rigor by scientists who, whatever their personal beliefs, are committed to following the evidence wherever it leads. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is a near-death experience? The term was popularized in the 1970s by Dr. Raymond Moody in his groundbreaking book Life After Life, but the phenomenon has been reported throughout history. A near-death experience, or NDE, occurs when someone comes very close to death, typically during cardiac arrest, severe trauma, surgery complications, or life-threatening illness, and reports a series of experiences that seem to occur while they were clinically dead or very close to it. Now, it's crucial to be precise about what clinically dead means here. We're not talking about final, irreversible death. We're talking about moments when the heart has stopped, when brain activity has ceased or severely diminished, when by all standard medical measures, the person should be unconscious and unaware. But they're not. Or at least, they report experiences that seem to have occurred during these periods. Dr. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia has spent nearly 50 years studying these experiences. He's interviewed more than 1,000 people who've had near-death experiences, documenting their accounts with scientific precision and developing scales to measure and categorize. What he's found is striking. Despite occurring in people from vastly different backgrounds, cultures, and belief systems, near-death experiences share common elements with remarkable consistency. The most frequently reported features include the sensation of leaving the body and viewing it from above. About 75% of people who have NDEs report this out-of-body experience. They describe floating near the ceiling, watching their own resuscitation, seeing medical equipment and procedures they'd never encountered before, and accurately reporting events that occurred while they were clinically unconscious. Here's a real example from the research file. A woman underwent cardiac arrest during surgery. Her brain was being monitored with EEG, showing no activity. Her heart wasn't beating. By every measure, she was unconscious. Yet when she was revived, She described in precise detail how the surgical team responded to her cardiac arrest. She mentioned that one surgeon had flapped his arms as if trying to fly, a strange detail that made no sense until the surgeon himself confirmed it. After scrubbing in, he had a habit of pressing his flattened hands against his chest to keep them sterile, a motion that did indeed look like flapping. This woman with a flat EEG with no heartbeat had somehow observed and remembered this unusual behavior. Then there's the sensation of moving through darkness toward light. About 65% of NDEs report this. The light is typically described as brilliant, but not harsh, welcoming rather than blinding, and often imbued with a sense of unconditional love and acceptance. Many people say they're drawn toward it, pulled gently but inexorably, feeling a peace and joy beyond anything they've experienced in ordinary life. Meeting deceased relatives or spiritual beings is reported by about 35% of experience. This is one of the most emotionally profound aspects of NDEs. People report encounters with parents, spouses, children or friends who died years or even decades earlier. These aren't vague impressions but specific, detailed interaction. The deceased appear healthy and whole, often younger than when they died, radiating peace and sometimes offering reassurance that it's not your time yet, or you have to go back. One particularly evidential case involved a woman who, during her NDE, met a young man who introduced himself as her brother. She was puzzled because she'd been raised as an only child, but after her recovery, when she mentioned this to her mother broke down and revealed that yes, she'd had a baby boy who died before the patient was born, a secret she'd kept for decades. The daughter had no normal way of knowing about this brother, yet encountered him during her near-death experience. The life review is another common element, reported by about 23% of NDEs. This isn't just a simple replay of memory. People describe experiencing their entire lives from a different perspective, seeing not just what they did, but how their actions affected others. They feel the joy they brought and the pain they caused, experiencing these emotions directly as if from the other person's point of view. It's often described as both illuminating and humbling, a complete moral reckoning that happens in what feels like an instant but encompasses an entire lifetime. A fascinating study published in 2023 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences provided some of the most intriguing neurological evidence yet for near-death experience. Researchers at the University of Michigan studied the brains of patients who died in the ICU, monitoring their neural activity continuously from the moment life support was withdrawn until all brain activity ceased. What they found was unexpected. In 2 of the 4 patients studied, there was a sudden surge of high-frequency brain activity called gamma waves in the moments after the heart stopped. These gamma waves are normally associated with heightened consciousness, memory processing, and the integration of different types of sensory information. Exactly the kind of brain activity you'd see in someone having a lucid, organized experience. This surge occurred in the temporoparietal junction, an area of the brain associated with dreaming, spatial perception, and sense of self. Now, these patients died, so we can't ask them what they experienced during these gamma wave surges. But the correlation is striking. These are precisely the kinds of brain signals we'd expect to see if someone was having vivid, integrated conscious experience. And they're occurring at a time when, according to conventional understanding, the brain should be shutting down, not ramping up into a state associated with heightened awareness. Dr. Jimo Borjigan, who led this research, found similar results in previous animal studies. When rats were induced into cardiac arrest, their brains showed a massive increase in gamma oscillations in the moments after the heart stopped. The brain didn't simply fade into unconsciousness.
Instead, there was a burst of organized, coordinated neural activity that lasted for seconds after clinical death began. What does this mean? Dr. Borgigan is careful not to overstate the finding. She notes that this could be the brain's final attempt to restart itself, a desperate surge of activity as systems fail. But it also provides a plausible neurological basis for why near-death experiences feel so real, so vivid, so memorable. If the dying brain is capable of generating highly organized gamma-wave activity, then it's capable of producing coherent, integrated conscious experiences, even in those final moments. But here's where things get really interesting. And this is what makes near-death experiences more than just an interesting neurological phenomenon. It's the out-of-body observations that are verified by third parties. It's the information that experiences shouldn't be able to know, but report accurately anyway. Dr. Sam Parnia at New York University has been conducting the AWARE study, Awareness During Resuscitation, specifically designed to test whether consciousness can exist independently of brain activity. In hospitals participating in the study, special images are placed on high shelves, positioned so that they're only visible from above, from the ceiling. The idea is simple. If people really do have out-of-body experiences during cardiac arrest, if they really do float near the ceiling as they consistently report, then some of them should be able to see and report these hidden images. The study is ongoing, and while results are still being compiled, the very fact that such research is possible and being taken seriously by major medical institutions tells us something about how the scientific community's attitude toward these experiences is evolving. But we don't need to wait for AWARE to see verified perceptions during NDEs. The literature is already filled with cases where people reported observations that were later confirmed. A man who had a cardiac arrest in the emergency room described a red shoe on the hospital roof, which staff subsequently found exactly where he said it would be. A woman accurately described a distinctive pattern on the top of a tall lamp in the operating room, a detail she couldn't have seen from her position on the operating table, but would have been clearly visible from the ceiling. In one particularly well-documented case from 1991, a woman named Pam Reynolds underwent a rare surgical procedure to remove a brain aneurysm. The operation required that her body temperature be lowered, her heart stopped, and her brain waves flat. Her eyes were taped shut and small speakers in her ears played loud clicking sounds to monitor her brainstem responses. By any measure, she should have been completely unconscious and unaware. Yet when she was revived, she described details of the surgery that she couldn't have possibly perceived through normal means. She described the bone saw used to open her skull, noting that it looked like an electric toothbrush. She described conversations between surgeons about her blood vessels being too small, conversations that occurred while she had no heartbeat, and flat EEG readings. The surgical team confirmed every detail she reported. Grayson has developed a scale to measure the depth and intensity of near-death experiences. This isn't subjective interpretation. It's a standardized tool used across different studies to compare and categorize. What this research has revealed is that the depth of the experience correlates with certain factors. People who were closer to actual death, whose hearts were stopped longer, whose brain oxygen levels were lower, tend to report more profound NDEs. This is the opposite of what we'd expect if these were merely hallucinations or the confused products of a dying brain. Hallucinations typically become less organized, less coherent, and less memorable as the brain becomes more compromised. Near-death experiences become more vivid, more organized, and more memorable the closer to death the person comes. There's also the life-changing impact. The vast majority of people who have near-death experiences describe them as the most significant events of their life. They report decreased fear of death, increased sense of life's meaning, enhanced feelings of compassion and love for others, and in some cases dramatic personality changes. They become more altruistic, less materialistic, more spiritual, though not necessarily more religious, and more certain that consciousness survives death. These aren't temporary changes induced by trauma. Follow-up studies years and decades later show these transformations persist. Dr. Grayson studied more than 1,000 experiences over decades and found that the psychological changes following NDEs are consistent and profound. People who were deeply fearful of death before their experience typically report having no fear afterward. Suicidal individuals often find renewed purpose. Those who are materialistic and self-centered frequently become more giving and focused on relationships. These are measurable, lasting psychological changes that are difficult to explain if NDEs are merely hallucinations. Now, it's important to note that not all near-death experiences are positive. While the majority are described as peaceful, loving, and transformative in a positive way, somewhere between 10 and 20% involve frightening or distressing elements. These negative NDEs might include feelings of terror, visions of hellish landscapes, or encounters with threatening beings. But even these distressing experiences often lead to positive psychological changes afterward. The experiencer might feel they've been given a warning or a chance to change, and they often do change, becoming more conscientious, more aware of how their actions affect others. What about alternative explanation? Could these experiences be caused by lack of oxygen to the brain, by drugs given during medical procedures, by the release of endorphins or other neurochemicals, by REM intrusion where the boundary between sleeping and waking breaks down? Scientists have examined all these possibilities carefully. The oxygen deprivation hypothesis seems plausible at first. We know that lack of oxygen can cause hallucinations. Fighter pilots in centrifuges sometimes report tunnel vision and other perceptual changes as G-forces reduce blood flow to the brain. But the experiences they report are fragmented, confused, and frightening. Nothing like the organized, coherent, peaceful experiences described in NDEs. Moreover, many near-death experiences occur in situations where oxygen levels were being carefully monitored and maintained. People have NDEs during surgery while under anesthesia with normal oxygen levels. The correlation with hypoxia just doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The drug hypothesis is similarly problematic. Yes, certain drugs can cause hallucinations, but the content is random, chaotic, often terrifying, and varies wildly from person to person. Near-death experiences show remarkable consistency across cases despite involving people who've had different drugs or no drugs at all. Some of the most profound NDEs occur in circumstances where no medications were administered. The endorphin, or neurochemical release theory, suggests that the brain floods itself with feel-good chemicals in times of extreme stress, creating peaceful hallucinations to cushion the blow of death. But this doesn't explain the specific content of NDEs, the verified perceptions, or why the experiences become more vivid and memorable as the brain becomes more compromised. It also doesn't explain why people would report watching their own resuscitations from outside their bodies, or encountering deceased relatives they didn't know were dead. REM intrusion, where rapid eye movement, sleep patterns intrude into waking consciousness, has been linked to some aspects of near-death experiences. A study in 2019 found that people who report NDEs are more likely to also report sleep paralysis and other REM-related phenomena. This is an intriguing correlation, but it's not a complete explanation. REM intrusion can explain certain perceptual experiences, but it doesn't explain verified perceptions of real events or the profound and lasting psychological transformation. The truth is probably more complex than any single explanation. Multiple factors likely contribute to near-death experiences: neurological, psychological, and possibly something else we don't yet understand. What we can say with confidence is that NDEs are real experiences with measurable effects, that they occur across cultures and throughout history, that they share common elements despite differences in belief and expectation, and that some aspects of them remain genuinely mysterious, even after decades of careful study. Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, conducted one of the most rigorous prospective studies of near-death experience. He studied 344 patients who survived cardiac arrest, interviewing them shortly after their experience, and then following up years later. He found that 18% reported a near-death experience. These patients showed no differences in oxygen levels, duration of cardiac arrest, or other medical factors compared to those who didn't have NDEs, but they showed marked differences in psychological outlook afterward, changes that persisted and even strengthened over the following year. Van Lommel's work is particularly important because it's prospective. He identified cardiac arrest patients ahead of time and studied them systematically, rather than relying on self-selected reports from people seeking to share their experience. This eliminates many potential biases and makes the findings more robust. What all this research points to is that consciousness during cardiac arrest, during periods when the brain should be unable to generate organized experiences, is more complex than we thought. The dying brain might have capabilities we don't fully understand. The relationship between consciousness and brain activity might be more nuanced than a simple one-to-one correlation, and the question of whether consciousness can exist independently of the brain, even briefly, remains genuinely open. Near-death experiences don't prove life after death. They occur in people who, by definition, don't actually die. They come close but return. What happens to consciousness during irreversible death remains unknown, but NDEs do suggest that consciousness near the point of death behaves in unexpected ways, that awareness can persist in circumstances where it shouldn't be possible, and that our understanding of the relationship between mind and brain is incomplete. As we continue our exploration tonight, keep these near-death experiences in mind. They're one piece of a larger puzzle, one category of phenomena that challenges our assumptions about consciousness and death. They're not the whole answer, but they're a fascinating hint that the answer might be more complex and more wonderful than we currently imagine.
Let's shift our focus now from the subjective experiences of those who've returned from death's door to the objective measurements of what happens in the brain during those final moments. Because one of the most fascinating developments in the past decade has been our ability to actually monitor brain activity as death approaches. To watch in real time what occurs in those mysterious minutes and hours when life transitions toward its end. For most of human history, death was a black box. We could observe the external signs, the cessation of breathing, the stopping of the heart, the cooling and stiffening of the body. But what happened inside the brain, inside consciousness itself, remained completely unknown. But today, we have tools that our ancestors couldn't have dreamed of. We can place electrodes on the scalp to measure electrical activity through electroencephalography, or EEG. We can monitor blood flow and metabolism through imaging techniques. We can track the brain's response to death with a precision that would have seemed like science fiction just a few decades ago. And what we're discovering is profoundly counterintuitive. The dying brain doesn't simply fade away like a candle guttering out. Instead, something remarkable happens. In the final seconds to minutes after the heart stops, after circulation ceases, after what we would call clinical death begins, the brain often shows a sudden surge of activity, organized, coordinated, high-frequency neural oscillations that look remarkably like the kind of brain activity associated with consciousness. Let's start with the landmark 2013 study from the University of Michigan. Jimo Borjigin and her team were studying rats, monitoring their brain activity before, during, and after induced cardiac arrest. What they found was startling. Within 30 seconds of the heart stopping, there was a sudden increase in high-frequency gamma oscillations across many brain regions. These weren't random electrical discharges. They were organized patterns of activity, showing increased coherence between different brain areas, suggesting that different parts of the brain were actually communicating more effectively than they had been during normal waking consciousness. Gamma waves are particularly interesting because in normal healthy brains they're associated with some of our highest cognitive functions: attention, memory processing, perceptual binding, the integration of information from different senses into a unified conscious experience. When you're concentrating hard, when you're having a moment of insight, when you're experiencing what psychologists call flow, your brain is generating gamma oscillation. So finding them surging in the dying brain, increasing rather than decreasing, suggests that something profound is happening in those final moments. Dr. Borjigin hypothesized that this might represent the brain's final attempt to restart itself, a last-ditch effort to survive. The brain is, after all, the body's most energy-hungry organ, desperately dependent on constant oxygen supply. When that supply is cut off, it makes sense that the brain would trigger emergency measures, activating preserved circuits, releasing neurochemicals, doing everything possible to recover function. But there's another possibility, one that's more speculative but equally fascinating. What if this surge of activity represents a final moment of heightened consciousness? What if the dying brain, freed from its normal regulatory constraints, enters a different state, not unconsciousness, but a kind of hyperconsciousness? It's a possibility that seems almost mystical, but it's supported by the phenomenology of near-death experiences, where people consistently report feeling more aware, more conscious, thinking more clearly than they've ever experienced in normal life. Then came the 2023. Researchers at the University of Michigan, including Dr. Borjigin, studied 4 patients who died in the ICU after withdrawal of life support. These patients had consented before their terminal illness to have their brain activity monitored during the dying process, providing an unprecedented opportunity to observe human brain function during death. 2 of the 4 patients showed remarkable activity. In the moments after their hearts stopped, as blood flow to the brain ceased, there was a sudden surge of gamma oscillations in the posterior cortical areas, particularly in the temporoparietal junction and the occipital cortex. This lasted for several seconds. Remember, these are brain regions associated with visual processing, spatial awareness, sense of self, and the integration of sensory information. They're the areas that would be active if someone was having a vivid, organized conscious experience. The researchers measured something called directed connectivity, essentially, where the different brain regions were talking to each other in an organized way. During this surge of gamma activity, connectivity increased. The brain regions were communicating, coordinating, functioning together, even as the heart had stopped and overall brain function was shutting down.
It's as if different parts of the brain were having one final conversation. Now, these patients died, so we can't ask them what they experienced during these surges of activity. But the neural signatures are remarkably similar to what we see in conscious, aware individuals. George Mashaw, who was part of this research team and directs the Center for Consciousness Science at the University of Michigan, was cautious but intrigued. He noted that this suggests consciousness might persist, or even peak, in those moments around death. It provides a potential neurological explanation for the vivid, memorable nature of near-death experiences. In 2022, neurosurgeon Dr. Ajamar Zemar and his team published a study that added another intriguing piece to this puzzle. They had recorded the brain activity of an 87-year-old man who was being monitored for seizures when he unexpectedly died during the recording session. This provided the first ever continuous EEG recording of a human brain actually dying. What they found was a specific pattern of brain oscillations in the moments before, during, and after death. There were rhythmic waves in the alpha and gamma frequency ranges, patterns similar to those seen during memory retrieval and dreaming. These oscillations persisted for tens of seconds after the heart stopped, long after the brain should have been unconscious. Dr. Zemar noted that the patterns were remarkably similar to what we see when people are remembering significant events from their life. It's almost as if in those final moments the brain was reviewing its own history. This ties back to one of the most commonly reported features of near-death experiences, the life review, where people describe seeing their entire lives unfold in an instant, experiencing not just the events but the emotions associated with them and the impacts they had on others. If the dying brain shows neural patterns associated with memory retrieval, this could explain why life reviews happen. The brain in its final moments might be accessing and integrating memories across the entire lifespan, creating that panoramic perspective on a life lived. Dr. Sam Parnia, who's been studying consciousness during cardiac arrest for decades, calls this twilight consciousness. He notes that we've been declaring people dead at the moment their hearts stop, but the brain might still be active for minutes afterward. We've been treating death as an instant, a moment, when in reality it's a process, sometimes a prolonged one, during which consciousness might persist in some form. This raises profound questions about organ donation, about when we pronounce death, about what's actually happening in those minutes after the heart stops. If the brain is still active, if there's still some form of awareness or experience occurring, then death isn't the binary state we've assumed it to be. It's a transition, a gradual dimming rather than a switch being flipped. What all of this research into the dying brain reveals is that death is far more complex than we realized. It's not a moment but a process. The brain doesn't simply shut down, it goes through stages, some of which involve increased activity rather than decrease. The relationship between neural activity and conscious experience remains mysterious, especially during these extreme states, and the question of whether consciousness can exist independently of brain activity, even briefly, remains genuinely open. These findings don't prove life after death. They don't tell us what happens to consciousness once all brain activity has irreversibly ceased, but they do show that consciousness, near the point of death, behaves in unexpected and fascinating ways, that the boundary between life and death is blurrier than we thought, and that much remains to be discovered about those final moments, and what they might reveal about the nature of consciousness itself. Now let's turn to what might be the most startling evidence in our entire exploration tonight. Cases of young children who spontaneously speak about previous lives, providing details that can be verified, making claims about people and places they've never encountered, and sometimes bearing birthmarks that correspond to fatal wounds from the deaths they describe. This is the domain of reincarnation research, and while it might sound like fringe pseudoscience, it's actually some of the most rigorous and carefully documented work in the entire field of consciousness studies. The pioneering figure in this research was Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, beginning in the 1960s and continuing until his death in 2007. Stevenson investigated more than 2,500 cases of children who claimed to remember previous lives. He traveled to India, Sri Lanka, Turkey, Lebanon, Thailand, Myanmar, and eventually to Europe and the United States, interviewing children, their families, and the families of the deceased individuals the children claimed to have. He documented his findings in meticulous detail, publishing books and academic papers that remain the most comprehensive collection of this type of evidence in existence. Stevenson wasn't a believer looking to confirm his belief. He was a skeptical scientist who stumbled onto these cases and felt compelled to investigate them properly. He approached each case methodically, looking for any possibility of fraud, coincidence, or normal explanation. He investigated whether the families might have known each other, whether the child could have been exposed to information about the deceased person through normal means, whether the child might be fantasizing or confusing real memories with things they'd heard or seen. Let's look at some specific cases, because the details matter. Take the case of James Luninger, born in 1998 in Louisiana. When James was about 2 years old, he began having terrible nightmares, thrashing in his sleep and screaming about a plane crash. His parents would hear him yelling, "Plane on fire, little man can't get out." These nightmares occurred almost nightly, distressing both James and his parents. As James grew a bit older and could communicate better, he began providing detail. He said he had been a pilot who flew off a boat, that his plane was shot down by the Japanese, and that he'd been killed at a place called Iwo Jima. He said his plane was a Corsair and the boat was called Natoma. He talked about flying with someone named Jack Larson. Remember, this is a toddler providing these details, a child who had no particular exposure to World War II history. James's father, Bruce Luninger, was deeply skeptical. He was an executive, not someone inclined toward belief in reincarnation. But the specificity of James's claims bothered him, so he began to research, and what he found was astonishing. There was indeed a small aircraft carrier, called the USS Natoma Bay, that saw action in the Pacific during World War II. There was indeed a pilot from that carrier named Jack Larson, and there was indeed a pilot from the Natoma Bay named James Huston, who was shot down by Japanese fire at Iwo Jima on March 3rd. Bruce Luninger tracked down James Huston's sister, Anne Barron, who was still alive. He shared his son's statements with her. She confirmed details that little James had mentioned, details about her brother's life, the circumstances of his death, even aspects of his personality. Young James had even mentioned names of other pilots from the squadron, names that appeared in historical records, but that were obscure enough that a child couldn't have encountered them casually. Or consider the case of Ryan Hammonds, who at age 4 in Oklahoma began insisting that he had lived before in Hollywood. He would look at his mother and say, "I used to be somebody else. I lived in Hollywood." He provided specific details. He said he'd been in movies, he'd had a big white house, he'd danced on Broadway, he'd traveled to Paris where he'd seen the Eiffel Tower lit up at night. He talked about having 3 sons, having been married 5 times, and living at a street address with the numbers H. Ryan's mother, Cindy, was deeply religious and didn't believe in reincarnation, but her son's obsession troubled her. She checked out books about Hollywood from the library, hoping to placate him. One day Ryan pointed to a man in a photograph from a 1932 movie called Night After Night, and said, "That's me." The man he indicated wasn't one of the stars but an extra or bit player in the background of a scene. Cindy contacted Dr. Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, who had taken over the reincarnation research after Stevenson's death. Tucker is a child psychiatrist with impeccable credentials, published in peer-reviewed journals, respected by colleagues who might not share his interest in reincarnation, but acknowledge the rigor of his methodology. Tucker investigated Ryan's case carefully. The man Ryan had pointed to in the photograph was eventually identified as Martin Martin, a Hollywood agent and movie extra who died in 19. Tucker and Ryan's mother traveled to Los Angeles and obtained Martin's death certificate and other records. The details lined up with stunning accuracy. Martin had indeed been married 5 times. He had indeed lived at an address with HH. He had indeed traveled to Paris. The historical records confirmed claim after claim that young Ryan had made, details that weren't widely known, that weren't in any books or easily accessible sources, details that a child in Oklahoma in the 2010s couldn't have known through any normal means. Or take the case of Cameron Macaulay from Glasgow, Scotland. Starting at age 2, Cameron began talking incessantly about Barra, a remote island in the Outer Hebrides. He'd never been there. His family had no connection to the place, but Cameron described living in a white house by a beach, having a black and white dog, and having a father named Shane Robertson, who died in a car accident. He drew pictures of the house, described the view from the windows, talked about playing on the beaches, and begged his mother to take him back to Barra. Cameron's mother eventually decided to take him to Barra, hoping to show him there was nothing there that matched his memories, and this would resolve his obsession. But when they arrived on the island and spoke to locals, they learned that there had indeed been a Robertson family who lived in a white house by the beach in the 19th, and a man from that family named Shane Robertson had died, though not in a car accident as Cameron believed, but he had died young and unexpectedly, which might explain Cameron's confusion. They visited the house Cameron had described. It was white, by the beach, with the view Cameron had drawn. The details matched. Cameron walked through it as if he'd been there before, though he'd never set foot on the island in his young life. The experience seemed to resolve something for Cameron. After visiting Barra, his obsession with his previous life faded, and he began living more fully as himself. These aren't isolated cases. Dr. Tucker has investigated hundreds of American cases now, and the patterns are consistent. About 70% of the children say they died violently or unexpectedly in their previous life. Males account for about 3/4 of these violent deaths, which precisely matches the statistical ratio of males who die of unnatural causes in the general population. The children typically begin speaking about their previous lives around age 2 or 3, when language skills develop enough to communicate, and the memories fade by age 7 or 8. Then there's the evidence of birthmarks and birth defects. About 35% of the children in Stevenson's and Tucker's research have birthmarks or birth defects that correspond to wounds from the deaths they describe. These aren't random marks. They appear in the specific locations where the previous person was shot, stabbed, or injured. One child in Turkey had a linear birthmark on his head that corresponded exactly to where a man he claimed to have been had been shot with a rifle. Another had birthmarks on his chest and back that matched entry and exit wounds from a fatal shoot. The correlation is sometimes startlingly precise. with medical records of the previous person's wounds, matching the location, and sometimes even the shape of the birthmark on the child. Dr. Stevenson documented these correspondences with photographs and medical records. He was particularly interested in cases where there were two birthmarks corresponding to entry and exit wounds, as these are much harder to dismiss as coincidence than a single mark. He found multiple such cases. The odds of a child randomly having two birthmarks in exactly the locations corresponding to another person's entry and exit wounds are vanishingly small. What does all this mean? Does it reincarnation? Tucker is careful with his language. He says the evidence is suggestive of survival of consciousness and its rebirth in a new body. He notes that reincarnation, if it occurs, appears to be the exception rather than the rule. Most people don't remember previous lives, and even children who do remember lose those memories as they mature. He also acknowledges that our current scientific framework doesn't include mechanisms for how memories or personality could transfer from one brain to another, but he also points out that absence of a known mechanism doesn't disprove a phenomenon. We knew gravity existed long before we understood how it worked. We observed evolution before we discovered DNA. Sometimes empirical evidence precedes theoretical understanding. The question isn't whether we can explain reincarnation within current neuroscience. The question is whether the evidence is strong enough to demand we expand our theories to account for it. What's undeniable is that young children sometimes make very specific statements about previous lives that are later verified as matching deceased individuals they had no normal way of knowing about. Whether this represents actual reincarnation, some other form of anomalous information transfer, or subtle normal explanations we haven't fully explored, remains a matter of debate. But the phenomena themselves, the statements, the verifications, the patterns, are well documented and deserve serious consideration in any examination of consciousness and survival.
As we continue our journey through the mysteries surrounding death and consciousness, we come to a phenomenon that is perhaps the most paradoxical and deeply moving of all: terminal lucidity. This is the unexpected return of mental clarity, memory, and communication ability in people with severe dementia or brain damage in the days, hours, or minutes before death. It shouldn't be possible. According to our understanding of how the brain works, it isn't possible, and yet it happens, witnessed by countless healthcare workers and family members, challenging our most fundamental assumptions about consciousness and its relationship to the brain. Imagine this scene, repeated in hospitals and nursing homes around the world. An elderly woman has been living with advanced Alzheimer's disease for nearly a decade. She hasn't recognized her own children in years. She's been non-verbal for months, unable to communicate even basic needs, her eyes vacant, seemingly absent from her own body. The disease has ravaged her brain, destroying the neural networks that once held a lifetime of memories, personality, skills, relationships. According to every neuroscience textbook, that person is gone, their consciousness irretrievably lost in the fog of dementia. But then, in her final hours or days of life, something remarkable happens. She opens her eyes. Recognition floods her face. She calls her daughter by name and speaks coherently for the first time in months or years. She asks how old she is, where she is, knows the answers to both questions, information that's been lost to her for years. She recognizes grandchildren she hasn't seemed to know, recalls events from her past, expresses love and gratitude. She's fully present, fully herself, the person she was before the disease took hold. And then sometimes hours later, sometimes just minutes, she dies. This is terminal lucidity, also called paradoxical lucidity, because it contradicts everything we think we know about irreversible brain damage. The term paradoxical captures the medical community's bafflement. How can someone whose brain has been physically destroyed by Alzheimer's or other dementia suddenly regain clear thinking? How can neurons that have died or been damaged beyond repair suddenly function normally? Dr. Alexander Bathiani, a researcher in Austria, conducted one of the largest studies of this phenomenon. He surveyed hospice workers, palliative care staff, and families across Europe, asking a simple question: have you ever observed an unexpected return to clarity in your Alzheimer's or dementia patients? The results were striking. Among 27 respondents, 24 reported witnessing at least one episode of terminal lucidity in a patient. That's more than half. This isn't a rare anomaly. It's common enough that most experienced healthcare workers in end-of-life care have seen. The National Institute on Aging in the United States has funded several research projects to study paradoxical lucidity, recognizing it as a genuine phenomenon worthy of serious investigation. In 2022, researchers at New York University began a 5-year study specifically designed to measure and document these episodes. They're recording brain activity, keeping detailed audio and video records, and having caregivers maintain careful diaries of when and how these moments of clarity occur. Let's look at what these episodes actually involve. A study published in 2023 interviewed family caregivers of 30 people who had lived with severe dementia. Of these, 25 caregivers reported witnessing at least one lucid episode, totaling 34 separate episodes across all the cases. Most of the episodes were brief. 21 of the 34 lasted only seconds. The others ranged from a few minutes to, in one case, 40. During these episodes, patients might speak in complete sentences for the first time in months, appropriately respond to yes or no questions, recognize family members they haven't known, describe memories from their past, or express awareness of their current situation. In one documented case, a 67-year-old woman with vascular dementia who had been nonverbal suddenly spoke to her physical therapist during a family visit. She talked coherently about significant people, places, and life events. She remembered family members' names. There was a sudden increase in her clarity of thought, and she even remembered how to play a musical instrument she hadn't touched in years. This clarity lasted several minutes, witnessed by both the therapist and family. She died 1 week later. In another case, a 92-year-old woman with 9 years of advanced Alzheimer's who hadn't recognized her own son in years, suddenly recognized him and other family members 24 hours before she died. She knew how old she was, where she was, and could answer questions appropriately. Cognitive abilities she hadn't demonstrated in nearly a decade. The emotional impact of these episodes on families is profound and complex. 72% of caregivers in one study reported feeling positive about witnessing terminal lucidity. They felt it gave them closure, a final opportunity to connect with their loved one, a brief return of the person they'd been mourning for years. But 17% of caregivers found the experience stressful or emotionally difficult. The sudden return and then loss felt like a second grief, a reminder of all that had been lost, followed by having to lose it again within hours or days. The phenomenon raises profound questions about the nature of dementia and consciousness. If someone with severe, irreversible brain damage can suddenly regain normal function, even briefly,
What does that tell us about whether the damage is truly irreversible? Are the neurons actually dead, or are they dormant? Is the information actually lost, or is it merely inaccessible? In 2021, researchers proposed a hypothesis involving neuromodulation. They suggested that in the final hours before death, there's a massive release of neurotransmitters and hormones: dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, corticotropin-releasing peptides that might temporarily reactivate preserved neural circuits. The hypothesis suggests that while large portions of the brain are damaged in advanced dementia, some circuits, particularly in the medial prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, might remain intact but dormant. These sudden neurochemical surges might wake them up, allowing final moments of clarity. What's particularly striking is that terminal lucidity seems to occur most often when family members are visiting. Researchers have documented that the episodes frequently coincide with the presence of loved ones, particularly family members the patient was closest to earlier in life. This might be because families are more likely to notice and report lucidity when they're present. But some healthcare workers and researchers speculate there might be something more to it, that the presence of emotionally significant people might trigger whatever neural or physiological mechanisms enable these episodes. There's a poignant case that illustrates. A woman in hospice had been in advanced dementia for several years, unable to recognize anyone, unable to speak. Her son visited regularly, sitting with her even though she showed no sign of recognizing him. On one visit just hours before her death, she suddenly opened her eyes, looked directly at him, said his name and told him she loved him and was proud of him. She spoke clearly, appropriately, with full awareness. Then she closed her eyes and died a few hours later. These questions touch on one of the deepest mysteries in all of consciousness research. What is the relationship between the brain and the mind? Are they identical, mind just being what brain activity feels like from the inside? Or are they distinct, with the brain acting as a kind of radio that receives or expresses consciousness rather than generating it? Terminal lucidity seems to support the latter possibility, suggesting that consciousness might persist even when the brain that normally expresses it is severely damaged. Healthcare workers who've witnessed terminal lucidity often describe it as one of the most profound experiences of their career. Nurses in particular, who spend the most time with dying patients, report that these episodes change how they think about consciousness, death, and what it means to lose someone to dementia. If the person can come back, even briefly, even in their final moments, were they really gone? Or were they always there somehow, just unable to express themselves, trapped behind the wall of their damaged brain? As research continues, terminal lucidity may offer unique insights into consciousness, the brain and their relationship. Whatever we ultimately discover about the mechanisms behind these episodes, they remind us that the dying process holds mysteries we're only beginning to explore, and that consciousness near the end of life might be far more complex and more present than we've assumed.
Moving from terminal lucidity to the experiences reported by conscious patients in their final days, we encounter another phenomenon that's both ancient and newly studied: deathbed visions. These are experiences where people who are dying, who are awake and alert, report seeing deceased relatives, spiritual figures, or other phenomena that aren't perceptible to anyone else around them. Unlike near-death experiences which occur during medical crises when the person is unconscious, deathbed visions occur while the person is conscious and able to communicate. Christopher Kerr at Hospice Buffalo in New York has conducted some of the most comprehensive research into these experiences. Between 2010 and 2015, his team interviewed 1,400 dying patients, asking them daily about their dreams and visions. The results revealed something that hospice workers have observed for decades, but that mainstream medicine has largely ignored. These experiences aren't rare. They're extraordinarily common. About 88% of the patients reported at least one dream or vision related to death, deceased, loved ones, or preparation for a journey. Think about that number. Nearly 9 out of every 10 dying patients report these experiences. This isn't a fringe phenomenon. It's a central part of the dying process for most people. Yet it's something that medical education barely touches on, that families are often unprepared for, and that gets dismissed as confusion or medication effects by healthcare workers who haven't been trained to recognize it. So what exactly do these deathbed visions involve? The most common content, reported by about 57% of experiences, involves deceased relatives. Parents, spouses, children, siblings, friends who died years or even decades earlier appear to the dying person. These aren't vague presences, they're specific individuals, recognized and named, often appearing younger and healthier than when they died. The deceased typically seem to have come to provide comfort, reassurance, and sometimes an explicit message that they'll be there when the person crosses over, that they won't be alone. One hospice nurse described a patient who kept looking at a spot near the foot of his bed and smiling. When asked what he was seeing, he said his mother was there. She'd been dead for over 20 years. He described her appearance in detail. She looked as she had when he was a child, healthy and happy, and she was telling him everything would be okay, that it was time to come home. The patient seemed comforted by this, his anxiety about dying visibly diminished. He died peacefully 2 days later. In another case, a 67-year-old woman saw her husband, who had died 4 years earlier, accompanied by their dog who had died at age 22. She described them both in detail, said they were together and waiting for her. This vision brought her tremendous peace. She'd been anxious about dying, worried about what would come next, but after seeing her husband and their beloved pet, she became calm, even seemed to look forward to death as a reunion. These visions often occur in the days or weeks before death, and they typically increase in frequency as death approaches. About a third of dying patients report themes of travel or preparation, packing bags, getting ready for a journey, waiting for transportation, planning to go somewhere. These metaphors for death appear across cultures. Religious or spiritual figures also appear, though less commonly than deceased relatives. About 19% of patients report encounters with angels, Jesus, Buddha, or other spiritual beings depending on their religious background. An elderly woman who was alert and oriented told her nurse that angels had gathered around her hospital bed and were ready to take her home. She died peacefully shortly after. Sometimes the visions provide information that later proves accurate in unexpected ways. In one striking case, a woman during her deathbed vision encountered a young man who introduced himself as her brother. She was confused because she'd been raised as an only child. But after she recovered briefly and mentioned this to her mother broke down and revealed a long-kept secret. She had indeed given birth to a baby boy who died shortly after birth, years before the patient was born. The daughter had no normal way of knowing about this brother, yet encountered him in her vision. Dr. Kerr's research found that the content of dreams and visions changes as death approaches. In the earlier stages, days or weeks before death, patients might dream about their past, reliving important moments, seeing people who are still alive,
But as they get closer to death, the dreams increasingly feature people who have died. The deceased loved ones become more prominent, more frequent, more central to the experience. The visions are almost always comforting. When Dr. Kerr's team asked patients to rate the emotional tone of their experiences, about 60% described them as comforting or extremely comforting. Only about 19% found them distressing. This is crucial because it distinguishes these experiences from delirium. Patients with delirium are agitated, confused, distressed by their hallucinations. Patients having deathbed visions are typically calm, lucid, comforted by what they're seeing. Family members and caregivers who witness these experiences often find them deeply meaningful. A study of caregivers found that the more comforting the patient's dreams and visions were, the better the bereavement experience was for the family members left behind. Knowing that their loved ones saw and found comfort in deceased relatives, that they weren't alone or afraid, that they seemed to be welcomed into something peaceful, this provided significant consolation in grief. Hospice workers report that patients who have these experiences typically die more peacefully. One study found that 95% of patients who had deathbed communications with deceased friends or relatives passed away peacefully, compared to much higher rates of terminal agitation in patients who didn't report such experiences. What do these experiences mean? Are they evidence of an afterlife, of deceased loved ones actually coming to help the dying cross over? Or are they the brain's way of processing death, generating comforting images to ease the fear? The scientific literature carefully avoids making claims either way. What researchers can say with confidence is that these experiences are real in the sense that they happen, they're consistently reported, they have specific characteristics, and they have measurable psychological effects on both patients and family. Cultural variations in deathbed visions are interesting. The basic phenomenon appears universal. Dying people across all cultures report visionary experiences, but the specific content varies with cultural and religious background. Christians see Jesus or Mary. Hindus see religious figures from their tradition. The personal nature of the experience, tailored to the individual's beliefs and relationships, could support either interpretation that these are internally generated experiences reflecting the person's own mind, or that they're real encounters with a spiritual reality that manifests in culturally appropriate forms. Interestingly, children who are dying sometimes report seeing beings they identify as angels or helpers. These children describe beautiful, welcoming figures who come to help them, who tell them not to be afraid. Even very young children dying from illness report these encounters and seem calmed by them. Animals feature in deathbed visions more often than might be expected. Dying patients report seeing deceased pets, dogs, cats, horses that were important to them in life. An elderly woman saw her favorite dog who had died years earlier, described it by name and appearance, and seemed comforted by its presence. The timing of deathbed visions is also significant. They typically begin days to weeks before death, increasing in frequency as the end approaches. Some patients report that on their final day the visions become almost continuous, that the boundary between the physical world and whatever they're seeing seems to dissolve. A survey of 33 Brazilian healthcare workers found that 71% had observed or heard reports of end-of-life experiences. About 88% of the healthcare professionals believed that deathbed visions represent a transpersonal experience, meaning something that goes beyond the personal and individual, potentially touching on spiritual or transcendent realities. This belief among healthcare workers is significant. These are people who see death regularly, who understand the medical process, who know the effects of medications and disease on the brain. Yet after witnessing hundreds of deaths, after hearing countless patients describe their visions, after observing the comfort these experiences bring, many of them conclude that something profound is occurring. Medical education and practice are slowly beginning to take these experiences more seriously. Hospice programs are training staff to ask about dreams and visions, to normalize them, to help families understand that they're a common and meaningful part of dying, rather than dismissing them as confusion or prescribing medication to suppress them. The recommendation now is to listen, to validate the experience, to help the dying person make sense of what they're encountering. Deathbed visions remind us that dying is not just a biological process, but a human experience, rich with meaning and complexity. Whether they're generated entirely by the dying brain, or represent genuine encounters with a spiritual reality, they play a profound role in how we face death and how those left behind cope with grief.
So far, we've explored empirical evidence, observations, experiences, documented phenomena. Now let's venture into the realm of theory, into the frameworks that scientists and philosophers have proposed to make sense of consciousness, death, and the possibility of survival. This is more speculative territory, but it's also where some of the most fascinating ideas emerge. Ideas that connect cutting-edge physics with ancient intuitions about the nature of mind and reality. Let's begin with the hardest problem in all of science: consciousness itself. What is it? How does subjective experience arise from physical matter? Why is there something it's like to be me, to be you, rather than everything happening in darkness, without awareness or feeling? This is what philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. And despite tremendous advances in neuroscience, we're no closer to solving it than we were a century ago. We know a lot about what consciousness correlates with. We can map which brain areas are active during different mental states. We understand the neural correlates of vision, emotion, memory, decision-making. But correlation isn't explanation. Knowing that certain neurons firing correlates with the experience of seeing red doesn't explain why seeing red feels like anything at all. This explanatory gap has led some scientists to propose more radical theories. What if consciousness isn't produced by the brain? What if it's fundamental to the universe, like mass or charge, and the brain is more like a receiver or filter than a generator? This is the intuition behind several theories that connect consciousness to quantum mechanics. The most prominent is the orchestrated objective reduction theory, or ORC, developed by physicist Sir Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Dr. Stuart Hameroff. Their theory proposes that consciousness arises from quantum processes inside tiny structures within brain cells called microtubules. These microtubules might be maintaining quantum coherence, the delicate state where quantum effects can occur. In quantum mechanics, particles can exist in superposition, being in multiple states simultaneously until observed or measured. Penrose proposed that consciousness involves quantum superpositions in the brain collapsing in a specific way. When these quantum states collapse, they create moments of conscious experience. Hameroff's contribution is the idea that microtubules in neurons orchestrate these quantum collapses, creating the unified field of consciousness we experience. If OR is correct, it has profound implications for survival after death. Penrose and Hameroff suggest that the quantum information in microtubules might not be destroyed when the brain dies. Instead, it might dissipate into the universe at a fundamental level, potentially persisting in some form. During a near-death experience,
This quantum information might briefly dissociate from the body before reintegrating if the person is resuscitated. This sounds like science fiction, and many physicists are skeptical. The brain is warm and wet, not the kind of environment where quantum effects typically survive. But Hameroff and colleagues have presented evidence that microtubules might be capable of maintaining quantum coherence for longer than expected. Laboratory studies have found quantum effects in biological systems that persist at room temperature. Plants use quantum coherence in photosynthesis. Maybe the brain has evolved ways to exploit quantum effects too. Another approach is biocentrism, proposed by Dr. Robert Lanz. Biocentrism reverses the usual understanding of the relationship between life and the universe. Instead of the universe creating life, biocentrism suggests that life and consciousness are fundamental, and the physical universe is a construct of conscious space, time, matter. All the things we think of as objectively real are actually experiences within consciousness. Lanza draws on quantum mechanics, particularly the observer effect, where the act of observation seems to determine quantum state. Until measured, a quantum particle exists in superposition. The measurement, the observation, collapses it into a definite state. This has led some physicists to suggest that consciousness plays an active role in creating reality. If consciousness is fundamental and the physical is derivative, then death becomes a different kind of transition. The body dies, but consciousness, being more fundamental than physical matter, continues. It might not continue as individual consciousness in the way we normally conceive of it, but as part of the fundamental consciousness from which physical reality emerges. Then there are ideas from the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. This interpretation suggests that every quantum event causes the universe to split into multiple branches, each representing a different outcome. Some have speculated that consciousness might follow the branch where it continues to exist, leading to the concept of quantum immortality. All of these quantum theories share something in common. They suggest consciousness might not be entirely reducible to brain activity, that there's something about awareness or information or subjective experience that exists at a more fundamental level than neurons firing. If that's true, then death of the brain might not mean death of consciousness. But we need to be careful. Quantum mechanics is strange and counterintuitive, and it's easy to invoke quantum as a kind of magic explanation. Just because quantum mechanics is weird, doesn't mean it explains consciousness or supports life after death. The math of quantum mechanics is precise and testable. When people use quantum ideas to support spiritual concepts, they're often going beyond what the physics actually said. What quantum mechanics does provide is a demonstration that reality at the fundamental level is far stranger than our everyday experience suggests. Particles can be in multiple states at once. They can be entangled across vast distances. Observation seems to play a role in determining state. This strangeness opens the door to questions about consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. Dr. Amit Goswami, a quantum physicist, has proposed that consciousness is the ground of being, the fundamental reality from which matter emerges. If consciousness is primary and matter is secondary, then death is the dissolution of the material form, but not the end of consciousness. The challenge with all these theories is testability. How do we test whether consciousness is fundamental or emergent? How do we determine whether quantum processes in microtubules are relevant to consciousness? These are philosophical frameworks that might help us think about these questions, but they're not yet scientific theories in the rigorous sense of making specific testable predictions. What we can say is that consciousness remains deeply mysterious. Despite decades of research, We don't have a complete explanation of how subjective experience arises from physical process, and we don't know whether consciousness is entirely dependent on the brain, or whether it has some existence beyond physical brain activity.
We've traveled through a lot of territory tonight, from the ancient roots of humanity's belief in survival after death, through near-death experiences and the surge of consciousness in dying brains, past reincarnation cases and terminal lucidity, alongside deathbed visions and quantum theories. Now it's time to step back and ask, what does all of this mean? What can we actually conclude? Let's start with what we know. We know that near-death experiences are real phenomena, with consistent features across cultures and consistent psychological effects. We know they can include verified perceptions. We know the dying brain shows surges of organized activity. We know some young children make remarkably specific statements about previous lives that are later verified. We know people with severe dementia sometimes regain clarity before death. We know most dying patients report visions of deceased loved ones. All of these are observational facts, well documented and studied. The question is what they mean, how we explain them, whether they point to something beyond the physical or can be understood entirely within conventional neuroscience. The skeptical view is that all of these phenomena, however remarkable, have normal explanation. Near-death experiences are products of a dying or stressed brain. The gamma wave surges are the brain's final attempts to restart itself. Children's past life memories are coincidence or unconsciously absorbed information. Terminal lucidity represents fluctuating brain function. Deathbed visions are comforting hallucinations. Nothing here requires us to invoke survival of consciousness. This skeptical view is intellectually responsible. It doesn't claim more than the evidence supports. In science, the burden of proof is on the extraordinary claim. Consciousness surviving death is an extraordinary claim. And by that standard, the evidence we've looked at tonight, while intriguing and suggestive, doesn't meet the bar for proof. But here's the thing. The skeptical explanations, while possible, often feel strained. They require us to invoke multiple different mechanisms when a single explanation might account for all of them. They leave us with accumulating anomalies, cases that are technically possible to explain away but that become less plausible as they accumulate. Take the verified perceptions during near-death experiences. Yes, it's possible the patient wasn't quite as unconscious as we thought, but when patients describe specific details they couldn't have heard, when they report events in other rooms while their EEG shows no activity, at some point the explanation starts to avoid the obvious possibility that consciousness continued while the brain was non-functional. Or children's past life memories. Yes, it's theoretically possible that every verified case involves coincidence or fraud, but when you have hundreds of cases, when the children make statements before the deceased individuals are identified, when there are birthmarks corresponding to wounds, at some point they must have learned this normally, seems less likely than maybe some aspect of consciousness can carry over. Terminal lucidity might be the most philosophically provocative. If a person whose brain has been destroyed by Alzheimer's can suddenly regain full cognitive function, even briefly, what does that tell us about whether the brain generates consciousness or merely expresses it? The difficulty is that none of these phenomena by itself is conclusive. Each can be explained away even if the explanations feel forced. But taken together they create a pattern, a convergent set of observations that all point in the same direction. Consciousness near death behaves in ways that don't fit neatly into a purely materialist framework.
Does this prove life after death? No. These experiences happen to people who don't die permanently. They occur at the boundary between life and death, but they don't cross over and return. What they do show is that the boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness, between life and death, is far more complex than we thought. There's a twilight zone where consciousness persists or even intensifies while the body and brain are shutting down. What happens beyond that twilight zone, when death becomes irreversible, that remains unknown. The evidence we've examined tonight doesn't tell us. It can't tell us. By definition, people who have permanent death don't come back. So we're left with suggestive but not conclusive evidence. We have hints, phenomena that don't quite fit into our current scientific framework. We have experiences that millions of people find transformative. We have observations that challenge our assumptions about consciousness and the brain, but we don't have proof. Maybe that's okay. Maybe the question of life after death isn't one that can be definitively answered from this side of the threshold. Maybe it's meant to remain a mystery, something we approach with evidence, reason, intuition, and faith, but never quite resolve. What we can say is that the materialist view that consciousness is just brain activity and ceases when the brain ceases is not as certain as it's sometimes presented. There are phenomena that don't fit easily into that framework. The question of survival is genuinely open, not settled. For some people, the evidence we've explored tonight will strengthen their belief in life after death. They'll see confirmation of what they already intuited. They'll find comfort in the thought that consciousness might continue, that we might be reunited with those we've lost, that death is a transition rather than an ending. For others, the evidence won't be persuasive. They'll see these phenomena as products of brain function. However remarkable, they'll maintain that consciousness depends entirely on the brain, and that when the brain dies, consciousness ceases. And there's a third position, perhaps the wisest, acknowledging that we simply don't know. The evidence is intriguing but not conclusive. The theories are interesting but speculative. We can be open to the possibility without claiming certainty. We can hold the mystery with humility. What's most important isn't reaching a definitive answer. We can't, but rather changing how we approach death. The research we've explored tonight has practical implications regardless of whether it proves survival. We should take near-death experiences seriously. When patients report them, we should assume people with severe dementia might still be present in some way, still deserving of dignity. We should encourage dying patients to share their visions and validate them. We should train healthcare workers to recognize that these experiences bring comfort. The research into consciousness at the end of life is changing how medicine approaches death. There's growing recognition that dying isn't just a biological process, but a human experience rich with meaning. The focus is shifting from merely managing symptoms to honoring the full experience of the dying person. Whether or not consciousness survives death, the question itself reveals something important about human nature. We are meaning-making creatures. The fact that every culture has developed beliefs about life after death tells us something about how our minds work, about what we need psychologically and spiritually. Maybe survival is real, maybe it's a comforting illusion, or maybe the question is somehow wrong, based on faulty assumptions. Maybe what continues isn't us in any recognizable sense but something more fundamental. Maybe death is like a wave subsiding back into the ocean. The wave disappears but the water continues. These are ancient questions that science is adding new tools to investigate. But science alone probably can't answer them fully because they touch on aspects of reality that might not be accessible to objective investigation. Consciousness is inherently first person, and death is the ultimate barrier. We can study the approach but not what lies beyond. So perhaps the question will always remain partially in the realm of philosophy, spirituality, and personal belief. The evidence can inform those beliefs, can make them more sophisticated, but probably can't replace them with certainty. What we're left with is a rich, complex picture. There are phenomena science is only beginning to investigate. There are experiences that challenge materialist assumptions. There are mysteries about consciousness that remain unsolved. And there's the possibility, no more than possibility, but a real possibility, that death is not the absolute end. As we come to the end of our exploration tonight, I hope you're left not with final answers, but with a deeper appreciation for the mystery itself. The question of what happens after death is the ultimate frontier, the one threshold every one of us will eventually cross, the one journey from which no traveler has returned with verifiable proof of what lies beyond. We've looked at the evidence near-death experiences with their verified perceptions, the dying brain with its paradoxical surges of consciousness, children who remember previous lives with startling detail, dementia patients who regain clarity in their final moment, dying people who see and find comfort in visions of deceased loved ones. We've explored theoretical frameworks that might provide ways of thinking about consciousness and its potential survival. None of this proves life after death in the strict scientific sense, but all of it suggests that the materialist view is incomplete. There are phenomena that don't fit neatly into that framework. There are experiences that challenge our assumptions. There are mysteries that remain unsolved. What we can say with confidence is that consciousness near the point of death is more complex than we realized. There's a twilight zone where awareness can persist or even intensify while the body and brain are shutting down. People in this state report experiences that are vivid, memorable, and often transformative. Whether these experiences represent glimpses of an actual afterlife or the brain's final gift to itself remains unknown. Maybe both interpretations have truth. Maybe the distinction between subjective and objective reality breaks down at the boundary of death. Maybe consciousness is more fundamental than we think, and death is the lifting of constraints. These are not questions that will be answered definitively. They require us to think deeply about consciousness, the relationship between mind and matter, the meaning of identity. They push us to the limits of what science can investigate and into the realm of philosophy and personal experience. But that's okay. Not every question needs a final answer. Some mysteries are meant to be lived with, contemplated, held lightly. The question of life after death is one of those. It's been with humanity since the beginning, and it will remain with us. What matters is how we respond. Do we approach it with curiosity and openness, or do we let it paralyze us or inspire us? Do we use it to avoid living fully, or as motivation to make the most of our time? Do we become more compassionate knowing everyone faces the same mystery? The research suggests that death, when it comes, might be less frightening than we imagine. Most near-death experiences are positive. Most deathbed visions are comforting. The dying process seems to involve a natural transition, a letting go, a sense of completion rather than terror. This doesn't eliminate the sadness of loss or grief. We still miss those who die. We still struggle with mortality, but it might take some of the existential terror away, might help us approach death with more acceptance and peace. For those caring for dying loved ones, this research offers hope that our family members are more present, more aware, and more comforted than they might appear. The person with dementia might still be there, The unconscious patient might be awake. The dying person might be experiencing comforting visions. For those facing their own mortality, this research offers the possibility that death is not the end, that consciousness might continue, that we might be reunited with those we've lost, that the love and relationships that gave meaning to our lives might persist beyond the death of the body. And even if none of that turns out to be true, the research tells us something valuable, that the dying process involves experiences of beauty, peace, and love for many people, that the final moments are often not suffering but release, that death, when it comes, might be a gentle transition rather than a harsh ending. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, or in quiet moments when you contemplate mortality, remember what we've explored together. The evidence is incomplete, but it's suggestive. The mystery remains, but it might hold more beauty and less terror than we fear. Consciousness is far more mysterious than we've assumed, and its relationship to the physical brain is more complex than simple materialism suggests. Hold these thoughts lightly. Don't cling to them as proof or reject them as wishful thinking. Let them be what they are: hints and intimations, suggestions and possibilities, evidence that the universe might be stranger and more wonderful than we know. Let them comfort you if they can, inspire you if they will, and remind you that the deepest questions about existence remain open. Until then, live fully, love deeply, pay attention to the mystery and beauty in every moment, and know that when your time comes, whatever lies beyond that final doorway, you're not alone in facing it. Every human who has ever lived has walked through it ahead of you, and if the evidence we've explored tonight holds any truth, some of them might be there to welcome you home.
Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. If you found this exploration meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Science Lullaby for more deep dives into the mysteries of science and existence. Sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful and filled with the comfort of knowing that the universe holds more wonders than we can imagine.